And welcome once again to the next interview for the Trees, People and Built Environment 4 conference online by the Institute of Chartered Foresters. Today, Sharon is speaking to Dinah Bornat.
Dinah is an expert on child-friendly cities, and she's researched and published extensively on the subject. She's a director of ZCD Architects. Hello, this is Tree Lady Talks, and I'm Sharon Durdant-Hollenby. All music and production is by Noel Durdant-Hollenby, and all views expressed by me or the interviewees are entirely personal. Welcome to Dinah Bornat. Thank you so much for joining us today. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, please, your background and your current role?
Yeah, so I'm an architect and I run an architecture practice called ZCD Architects with Cordula Weiser, and we're based in East London. We've been together since 2013, and what's interesting about our work is that we, like lots of architects, we work in housing, but we've done a bit of education, we do some commercial projects, but we've got a particular specialism in child-friendly cities and working and designing for and with children and young people.
I noticed that. I looked at your website, and also you have other roles, don't you, in terms of working with the London Mayor. Could you say something about your work outside of ZCD?
Like a lot of architects, we have both taught quite a lot, and I've done some teaching at University of East London, at University of Nottingham, currently about to start being an external examiner at Cardiff University. And I think that's a really important part of being an architect, is training the next generation. We tend to be kind of involved as design review panel members on councils in London, and also working as a mayor's design advocate with the Mayor of London. And that's been very interesting in the last few years, looking at sort of guidance and policy and how that is kind of needed for some of the bigger regeneration schemes. And in that role, helping Hackney as part of their child-friendly borough. So thinking about planning, really. I've got a master's from UCL actually in planning and urban regeneration, and I think that kind of crossover between architecture and urban design and planning, the lines are quite blurred, but I think it's really important that we understand the kind of context that we're working in and think about planning guidelines and sort of strategic thinking around design as well as the very small things. So we're kind of quite broad in that respect.
I think that's really good. A couple of things I got out of that was the fact that you had taught and involved as an assessor as well. And I think that is part of being a professional generally, is just looking to help the next generation or indeed career changers, step into and improve what they're doing. And that's something that, that I'm really interested in as well. And also almost cross-discipline working as well. So collaboration has been a real theme of Tree Lady Talks podcasts, and that's why we interview people from so many different backgrounds, because it's when we sort of slightly broaden our horizon that we can sort of think differently and start to solve some problems. And one of the ways that I think you really do that very well is the Youth Engagement Toolkit.
Well, it's a really interesting development in our work, I think. And it's come about from this interest in the way in which children and young people use space differently to adults. And we really started this kind of work through quite intensive observational work, I suppose influenced by Jan Gehl architects, who spend time looking at how people use spaces. And it's timely, really, because we are doing so much work on new housing developments, to think about the way in which people use the spaces in between the homes. In fact, it was when I was teaching at University of East London that the opportunity, I suppose, arose to work with the students, start looking at places and seeing whether there was a way in which we could sort of map how people were using space in relation to the sort of spatial layout. So what I mean is we developed some sort of mapping tools from observational work, where we started to see a correlation between the way that estates or neighbourhoods, if you like, were laid out and the levels of use of those spaces. And it's been a really important kind of foundation for our work, because it's research that cuts across some of the kind of commonly held ideas, if you like, and challenges some of those and reinforces some of the others. So, for example, some really interesting things that we found out when we started looking was that spaces that were used by children independently, so that means like playing outside without adults looking after you, were used more by other age groups in the community. The fact that a space can be used by children suggests that it's good for all of us. And some of the issues that seem to support that use of space really go back to some ideas that we learned from the play work world to do with time and permission and space, that play occurs when children have space, time and permission to do it. And so if we can get the space element right, and the permission comes from kind of, you know, how other adults behave in that space and signage and so on. But if we can get the space bit right, then we're kind of doing our jobs really well.
Yeah,
and so
absolutely,
what we found is that obviously overlooking is really important, but as well as that, connectivity is really key. Spaces need to be well connected to each other, and they also need to be directly accessible from homes. These are so blindingly obvious when you think about how you use space as a child, but yet we don't design for those layouts. So we will be asking designers, architects, developers to put developments together where play space needs to be located within a certain distance of a front door, but knowing, as we know, that won't get used if it's tucked away around a corner, if it's across the road. And actually, you only have to stop and think about that for one moment to realise that, you know, children are kind of motivated to play all the time, and adults just simply don't have time to sit and watch them play for as long as they need to play. That we need to be making these spaces where there's lots and lots and lots of opportunity for children to play out for as long as they might need to. And once we've done that as designers and planners, then it's the job of society to support that activity. But if we get it wrong, we've designed it out. And I think that's what we've been doing sort of unwittingly and wittingly for the last few generations. And it's really sad. And obviously the biggest threat is cars.
In my work as a chartered arboriculturalist, I do a lot of work on social housing estates in London where they're being redeveloped and improved. But play spaces are often tucked away, locked up, very hard in terms of the appearance, and there's no natural surveillance. I can see that changing now in my career working with other design teams, because when you are a parent or a guardian of children, you know, as you quite rightly say, people generally don't have the time to stand and watch. And there is a real sort of pandemic of loneliness, of obesity, and of children being more tech-based. Of course, there's advantages to technology, but it's that being outside, natural play, bonding with perhaps different ages of children, different types of children and different backgrounds is so important. And actually it's good for your physical health, not just the exercise, but your sort of gut biome, you know, getting your hands dirty. I don't know what you think about that. So when you have engaged with young people and children, what have they come back to you and said that they would like to see?
Good question. We don't ask them what they like, and that's what's really important about the work that we do. And we do a little bit, but the main thing that we're doing is we're tapping into this sense of their freedom to choose to do what they want to do. We recognise that there are lots of reasons why it's not so easy to run outside and play. I don't actually think technology is one of those reasons. What's really interesting about playing out is that it's still something that children really love and are motivated to do. I think it's innate in us, and we haven't evolved that fast that we've got we've got rid of that massive desire to mix and meet other and watch and explore the world.
Well, I hope we never do.
What's sad is seeing some children, not all children, are doing it an awful lot less, but some still are. And they all want to do it and they all really, really enjoy it. So what we do is we talk to them, and we talk to all ages. We talk to children at primary school and we talk to children at secondary school, and on our youth engagement toolkit, Voice Opportunity Power is really aimed at sort of secondary school age, but it's a very similar conversation that we have. It's about thinking about the space that you're in and whether that, like I said, gives you the freedom to choose to do what you would like to do there. And so that really taps into your sense of well-being and happiness. And it really presents a different way of thinking about what the outdoors offers. Otherwise, we think quite often about young people in terms of their safety, which is obviously really important. And then we get quite quickly onto things like knife crime and bizarrely stranger danger, which is kind of an incredibly low risk. But has been kind of over heightened, I think, in their lives. So this idea that space can give you happiness and joy are what we should be aiming for. Children are absolutely brilliant at reading space that they know and telling you, yes, that space. And then we ask them to rate the space as to whether it's green, amber or red. If that space allows them to do what they want to do in that space, that might be kick a ball around, it might be to sit around, it might just be to sort of chat to your friends, that is a green space. And an amber space is somewhere where there might be some rules and restrictions. And then there's red spaces. Now, a red space could be a road, a main road, and a green space could be a car park. It depends how you feel about that space. But what's really interesting is that if you think about it, we all really need green and orange in our lives a lot, and less red, don't we? In different communities, either culturally or spatially, some restrictions are placed on children. They're placed on children for lots of different reasons, particularly as they get older and they're expected to stay off the streets and stay at home working hard. And I think that may be particularly acute in London. Some children, the ones that play out least, are the ones that are much more likely to be worried about risk. And so they will look at a space and they'll risk assess it in front of you, and they'll say, oh, that slope looks a bit dangerous, you could fall down it, which is quite sad when you think about it, because you think, well, there's, who's going to be worried about a slope? And I think what you need to give them, exactly like you say, is the space and the time for them to explore those spaces regularly, to test them out, and to start to realise that risk is a risk worth taking, and that playing on it in different ways is how you learn about slopes and to climb trees. And actually, you really need to do that learning away from adults warning you constantly about the risk.
But the other thing about children playing is that they learn to risk take. Particularly young children learn that they can climb something or run over a log, and that sort of, they develop all those motor skills as well as social skills.
But I think it's really worth checking ourselves on that, because I don't think we've got a generation that you can define in one way. And that's something to be optimistic about, because what we have are lots of different experiences. So we're really seeing a huge variation in childhood experiences in terms of spaces to play. And some of that is deliberate in that parents can support that kind of activity. And some of it is because they live in places that are just naturally supportive. And I think what we need to get much, much better at as designers and team members, if you like, is recognising those spaces. And some of the best sort of collaborative conversations you might have on like a huge design team, who, you've got everyone from the transport engineer down to the services engineer, the arboriculturalist, everybody's there, the architect and the landscape architect. Is that if we are watching and noticing more about this kind of activity and realising that children are not doing what we do, they kind of behave differently to us, we'll get better at this.
We've talked a lot about natural surveillance, and just going back to my own experience, as a young mum, all those a couple of decades ago, we would say to each other, I wish we could just let our children out to play and sit and have a natter and know that they're okay, or we could take it in turns. But I looked at your website and I could see some designs that have that built into it. Just little small green areas of houses looking onto it. So tell us about those.
Okay, this is a really interesting project. It's quite small for this housing association. So we were given it to do, and it had run into some problems in that the previous planning applications had been made and had been rejected. And the reason was that it's on a really tricky site. It slopes down to the M40 motorway. So it's so noisy when you're there that you can't really have a proper conversation. So the planners recognised that the amenity space needed to be protected from the noise of the motorway. And so one of the senior design managers at the time recognised that what we were doing and thinking about the way in which people use space was going to be really helpful for this project. So we used the principles that we were working to think really hard about how the homes were going to protect this space, if you like, and create somewhere at the same time that was going to be really easy for children to be able to play out by themselves in that space, but well within sight lines of the home. So each of the homes is a 2-bedroom house, and it's an L shape. So it has its own courtyard, if you like, within the square of the plot. And from that courtyard and from the living space, you can see into this garden that most of the homes look out onto. The site itself was quite tight, like they always are. We're trying to get as many homes as we can onto the site. And of course, we're thinking then about access onto the site, about refuse collection, and about how we soften roadway around the homes. On the edge of the site, we've got a hedgerow and we've got some trees, and we're having to work really, really hard to make sure that we can maximise that central play space, amenity space, garden space for the communities. It's got allotment space there as well. And how that can not lose out to the roadway and the sort of necessary softening of that road space. We're going to have to lose some trees on the site. And the conversation then turns to, well, who and what is the priority here? The transport engineer is telling us we need a turning circle for the refuse lorry. We need to put some trees in between the bays of the parking. And of course, these access roads, if you like, which are not great spaces because they're on the outside of the homes and they are noisy because we're next to a motorway. This is not a place you're going to spend any time really, but it can't be just a sea of tarmac. And every inch seems essential, doesn't it? I struggle with the fact that the refuse lorry might need more space than a child playing. And what ends up having a fight with each other could be that existing tree against, enough space to make that central space even work and the scheme work itself. And I think isn't it interesting, and we work with the arboriculturalists on this, to balance those needs out and how difficult they are. And just yesterday in the debate about whether children are more important than trees, we really discussed this issue. And what we came to as a conclusion is that neither trees nor children have been prioritised in terms of our urban planning, because we really focus again and again and again on the car. And the first thing we do when we draw a development is where are the streets going to be and how we're going to kind of then fit in the homes around that. Going back to that scheme, I think it's potentially going to be really successful because, enough of these homes are around this community garden and the others can very easily access that space. And we hope that fosters a completely different use of space and community, and one in which you've got your own privacy, but you've also got this space that you can see onto, so the fence lines are low enough that when you're sitting on a chair, you can see into that space, same as the eye height of a 6-year-old child, because it's just as important for them to see in and out as well, so they can see friends are playing. I really wanted to make sure there was a climbable tree in that space as well, and that actually it wasn't over landscaped, or if you like, over kind of designed. So I'm just really interested in how this starts to work. And I know that people like Michael Ritchie's, the architects who won the Sterling Prize last year, are real supporters of our work, and that their work in Norwich, for example, really kind of uses these principles. And I think it's really encouraging that lots and lots of architects now are kind of saying, look, I think you're really onto something. It's really simple, and it's a way in which we can connect the people that we're designing for back to the designs that we're doing. So when we work on these big teams, the landscape architects and the architects just come together around these ideas, and are just sort of reinforces what they really want to be doing in the first place.
When I'm out on a walk with my tree lady talk, I can tell you I'm in my green heaven.
You have so many different demands on space when you're developing a site, such as sustainable urban drainage. You know, you can incorporate things like swales and rain gardens in this informal play, which is a great way for children to go and experience a space. Ecology areas and dead wood habitat and tree that's been felled that's actually lying on the ground to play on. And I think things need to be a little bit less tidy, because there's one thing that children love, well, I love, anybody should love, is grubbing around in the soil and peeling off bits of bark and look of a dead tree and seeing what's underneath. The more that we can think about bringing those things in as one entity.
You're absolutely right. Lots and lots of things should be able to happen in that space. And one of the ways in which I articulate that is to say play should be able to happen everywhere, but play isn't the only thing that happens in that space. I think it's really nice that you talked about grubbing around, because it's exactly the word that I used yesterday. And I asked Tim Gill and John Burke, who were the two speakers, what they thought about the idea that trees could look after play, and if they did, what would some of those play experiences be like? And that grubbing around and around the roots and peeling off the bark, as you said, most of the time they're digging with sticks, and it's really interesting. I think we need to get quite forensic about the way in which children play, because otherwise we assume that they're sort of on a swing bouncing up and down on a chicken. But actually, if we recognise that a lot of the stuff that they might be doing is sort of digging around in the dirt, then we might not be providing the right spaces for them. And that's a really simple activity. And it does require us to get less obsessed with the tidiness
and cleanliness.
And we need to stop, again, putting maintenance at the top, or really rethinking maintenance. And I'm really encouraged that I know that they're doing that in this borough where I live in Hackney. I was walking through a housing estate at the weekend with a friend, and he was telling me that they put in some equipment, but actually he showed me, look, the children are just digging away in that corner and that corner. And I said, this is what they want to do. And actually, it's not antisocial.
We have perhaps in the 70s, 80s and 90s, or maybe even now, focus on play being something that you purchase and you install. You know, you buy the swings, you lay the rubber matting, but actually playing in mud with sticks, I mean, that was my childhood. All of those things, it is something, as you said earlier, it's innate in us. It's in our DNA to feel the soil, to be around plants, to explore the world. That's how we originally survived. I mean, I'm no anthropologist, but we should be embracing that.
You're absolutely right. We shouldn't be thinking about it from an equipment point of view. We should be thinking about whether the spaces and the things that we put in them kind of offer play potential. And then we need to know what play is. Play doesn't really work when you can't adapt and manipulate things. So that loose parts play, where you're able to kind of have agency over the things that you're playing with, doesn't work on a kind of a bar that doesn't move, or a step that just does one thing. These things offer very, very limited play opportunity. We've got to get better at recognising what play is, because if play is a right, and then from that what follows on is, reduction in obesity, but just focusing on that right, it means that we've got to get better at designing for it. But we can't design for it unless we, perhaps think back, like you just did then, to what we used to do when we were children. Because as parents, most of the time we're preventing them from playing, because, our job is to stop them making a mess. Our job is to stop them shouting or screaming or kicking the ball against the wall. And so we are constantly, we're not always, but we're quite often stopping them playing. And so we think about it from a parent point of view, we're quite restricted. So we've really got to go back to what we used to do as children and start to see that resonance with children today, because it's definitely there.
It's using the resources that are there on site already. So, if trees are being felled, keep the timber on site and use that in a variety of different ways. Don't mow the grass in some areas. It's that fun of scuff through the leaves, stamp on a puddle, still do that now, swish along the long grass, have all those different textural experiences as well. And that is entirely in keeping with ecology and also, I think, beauty, but it's almost redefining what one expects to see as a play area away from something with yellow railings, multicoloured rubber surface and a few bouncy chickens. So exciting time. It's almost like rewilding play. There's a wonderful video on your website, London's Biggest Play Street. Tell us about that. You took over a street. What happened then?
Playing Out is a movement, a campaign, if you like, for supporting street play and closures of streets so that children can go out and play right in front of their homes, and sort of recognising the value that gives to all members of the community, whether they have children or don't have children. And it's a really lovely resident-led, volunteer-led idea. The Museum of London is on the edge of the borough of Islington, but in the City of London. There's far fewer people that live in the City of London, I think, than any other borough in London. And so why would you have a play street in the middle of a non-residential area? It was a deliberate experiment to see what happens when you allow children to take over a street. First of all, obviously, they have a great time, and so do their parents, and it's a fantastic activity. But what it's also done is it's allowed the museum and the city to rethink the way in which that space might be used and be designed going forward as the museum moves from its current location to the new one on the Smithfield site. Unfortunately, we couldn't run it again this year and learn from what we'd learned last year because of COVID. But what it has shown us is that the ability for children to kind of goes back to this idea of manipulating loose parts, because it's all about loose parts play. So it takes its idea from the kind of adventure playground, playwork world, and have them inhabit a space and just see what happens. And that's quite powerful because most museums you've probably visited, the messages that they send out within their spaces and outside are quite particular. But to experiment with a different kind of space where children have more power and control, where perhaps there's water, there's objects, there's a changing environment, is quite new, isn't it? So for the museum, it's the beginning of a journey. And that activity, we would really, really hope will happen again next year. And it will spark the beginning of the way in which not only the museum learns, but we all start using that space, and we start to give it memory and we start to give it meaning by the way in which we use that space. And so I'm just really interested in how people influence design, sometimes deliberately, but sometimes just through their actions. And that's what that's about.
I really enjoyed watching that. So I recommend that listeners go to ZCD Architects and click on the links there to see the videos of London's Biggest Play Street. It's very uplifting. Why have you become involved with trees, people and the built environment? What does it mean to you?
Well, I was asked to chair a debate, and Tim Gill, who is a researcher in designing cities for children and is bringing out a book in the next few months, early 2021, was invited to speak. And I thought it would be really interesting to have Tim and John Burke, who's a councillor in my local authority of Hackney in London. But what's interesting about John is that he is part of a huge programme to plant thousands of trees in Hackney. And alongside that, Hackney is working towards becoming a child-friendly borough. And for Hackney, that means particularly in the way in which we adapt and design new spaces. To have those two speaking together would be really interesting, because sometimes you come up against the sort of challenge of what's more important here. Is it that saving that ancient tree, or is it that we really shift the way in which we use these spaces? And I don't know what you think, Sharon, about that issue, because sometimes that means the ancient tree might have to go, but how do we balance that with, I think we have to balance that with people. We can't rebalance that with cars, right?
I'd like to see the ancient tree within an area of play, providing it's, I can hear all the arboriculturalists shouting at me, providing its root protection area doesn't become compacted. Yeah, I know that, folks who are listening. Let's mulch it. I think it really depends on the quality of the tree. So if it's not a particularly valuable tree, I'm not talking about ancient trees here, and it's a matter of space, and there are all those different pressures on the site, which I truly understand, then I think the children are more important. But if you're talking about an ancient or veteran tree, where possible, design around that one way or the other. But I know that it's complicated. I just tend to think those trees are irreplaceable. I'm hardcore on that. But I'm not on low value trees or even moderate value trees if it means that you can have a really meaningful play space and provide equivalent canopy cover of trees elsewhere within that development. So that's my view on it.
I think you're right. And I think that we also have to think long term, don't we? Because what kind of trees are we putting in, and what kind of play value are they going to provide? I do a lot of camping, and I do a lot of camping with children as well. And I know about trees in terms of how good they are for burning. I know about silver birch bark and how it releases natural oils that are flammable, and you know, the kind of the value, like you say, in picking apart a rotten piece of wood or breaking a dry stick. But if we are only thinking of trees for an ornamental point of view, and that's what I mean by the difference between play value. Play value is really about us touching and manipulating that tree, isn't it, and seeing if the branches bounce. And it's not a swing. It's not there just for that. It's there to love, isn't it? And to say to the children, no, you don't break off a living bough. That's there because it's growing. And to say, look, can you tell the difference between this bit which is dead and this bit which is living? And you can only learn that from actually touching and pulling and pushing a tree. And trees, as we know, are fairly robust when they get to a mature age. And you ought to be able to pull off a leaf and squash it between your hands, and that's how you're going to learn, isn't it? But it's there only for ornamental purposes. That's a shame, I think.
Well, I don't think trees ever are, because I think that the ecosystem services they provide, shade, water, mitigating water runoff, biodiversity, and also obviously improving the atmosphere. But actually beyond that, they actually do influence our behaviour. I mean, there are so many physiological studies of our own health showing that it's improved our mental and physical health. It's improved by trees in terms of all the obvious things they do, like pollution mitigation, but also in the way that they make us feel. I mean, one of the earlier podcasts was on mental health and nature, and there are studies which really show that it makes us feel better, it calms us down, relieves stress, lowers blood pressure. And all of those things are good for play, because if you've got trees around a space, it just also creates a sense of partial enclosure, so that you've got some trees to sort of hide behind peekaboo, hide and seek, and yet you can see between trees and underneath canopies. So I think it's much more about all the different ecosystem services as well as their ornamental qualities. And I think you can also we'll talk about rewilding play, you can have multi-stem shrubs, you can have lollipop trees, you can have multi-stem trees. All of those different elements are exciting for a child and for an adult to sort of play around. So it's that variety of heights and textures, well beyond just the ornamental.
We as designers, as architects just supposedly doing the buildings, we need to start getting a bit more sensitive to that and understanding, what we're talking about when we're talking about different trees.
Hence collaboration. Hence different professions speaking to each other, which is what the conference is all about, but really our professional lives is all about. And I think that's really improving. There is nothing I love more than an architect or a landscape architect coming to me and say, what about this? And I, coming up with ideas together. There's a huge potential for the green environment, grasses, bulbs, shrubs, all different sort of layers to be part of that play experience. And of course, they're doing so much else for us, almost without us realising it. Calm, happy, safe spaces.
In Poplar, in East London, we're working with primary school, secondary school children, and we're taking them around their local area, getting them to show us their local area. But it is interesting when you start to point out the trees. And we know that some of the trees there are mature plane trees, and that quite a few of those are going to be staying. And you realise that they haven't looked at these trees. They can't see that there are different types of trees until you start pointing and saying to them, can you see the difference between those trees? The most obvious difference is the leaves, but they're not looking and they're not thinking. And I suppose maybe it's because those trees are quite high and they're out of reach, and that's not what they're looking at. But I think it's a case of spending that time and having those things close to hand where they play, so that they can start to learn and get to know these things. The pattern on the trunk of a plane tree is quite distinctive, isn't it? If that was inside the play space, what would that mean and what could it offer? It's just a very different way of the landscape architect just plonking them on the drawing and saying, we've got lots of trees, and it's like, but where it comes into contact with children.
I think, definitely. I think we should be having this conversation with a landscape architect as well. I think there is so much more that can be done. We produced a big podcast recently for the Woodland Trust. We spoke to a school teacher about all the planting and the learning that they've been doing about trees as part of their education and play. But it's been really lovely to meet you.
Thanks, Sharon.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's so great to think about how we can get people playing naturally and how good design can make sure that children can feel safe while playing, while really exploring the natural world.
I thought it was interesting, actually. You were talking about getting your hands dirty and playing around in the mud.
I loved that. That was my childhood.
Oh, no. You
Only
said that once.
had a stick.
Yeah, playing with a stick, turning over a rock or two. Those were the days, eh? You can't do that anymore. Well, I suppose you can do that now, only in the safety of your own home. Now, I know there's something I know we do something special quite a lot, but next week, if I said the initials TK, who would you be talking about in trees? Think about it. It's the right answer.
Tony Kirkham, MBE
Tony.
of Kew Gardens. Oh, well, we love chatting to Tony.
We
He's
love Tony
such a good conversation.
It's fantastic. Tony Kirkham, honestly, he's turned up all over your TV screens. I cannot wait. Literally can't wait. I'm virtually bursting.
I know. Really looking forward to speaking to you, Tony.
In the meantime, that's another great interview, and look forward to the conference February the 3rd, February the 4th, and it's all going to go fantastically well. I hope you all have a great time, don't you, Sharon?
I definitely do, and 2 more interviews to come in connection with that conference. One the week after next and one the end of January. Really getting to know the key people behind the conference. Thanks for listening.
Okay, say goodbye, Sharon.
It's goodbye from him.
Are we nicking that?
Probably the 2 Ronnies or something.
2 Ronnies. We can get away with that. Nobody will know what we're talking about. That's fine. Just do the triangle.